Again, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. As every other Friday, we've been here since September. This is our last seminar for 2022. And we are very, very happy to have with us today Professor Panagiotta Hounari. Panagiotta is Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Massachusetts, and she will talk to us today. She will give us a talk on the debate around critical race theory in the US and the discourses around historical revisionism. We're very much looking forward to learn from you, Panagiotta. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I know the traffic is terrible and it's before the holidays. I'm happy to see familiar faces and new faces. I'm grateful to the two amazing scholars who have put this ambitious and very timely seminar together, Rosa and George. Thank you, and thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Institute, of course. I'm really honored. So yeah, today my talk is going to be on critical race theory and what's happening in the United States. With no further delay, I will start. It's the dog of the institution. Okay, all right. On May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin, after apprehending George Floyd for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill to buy cigarettes, he pinned him to the ground and kept his knee on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Chauvin didn't remove his knee even after Floyd lost consciousness and after paramedics arrived and while 3 more officers looked on. Hours after Floyd's murder, protests erupted in Minneapolis and quickly spread across the United States and beyond to over 2,000 cities and towns in 50 states and in over 60 countries. An estimated 15 to 26 million people participated at some point in those protests in the United States. There was no doubt a massive mobilization gaining momentum and strength. The murder and the mobilizations that followed triggered more discussions about police brutality, racism, discrimination, other forms of oppression and exploitation, and these discussions were taking place in schools, in the workplace, in the streets. And this is the point where conservatives jumped on the critical race theory bandwagon and started shifting the agenda. As issues of racial inequality were becoming part of workplace diversity trainings or integrated in classrooms, the emboldened Trumpist far right saw an opportunity. A new Red Scare was born. As one of the key players, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute tweeted at one point, American schools haven't whitewashed history, they've redwashed it. Instead of challenging racist structures in the context of capitalism that generate and legitimize police brutality and relegate people of color in the margins, America was talking about anti-racist curricula and diversity trainings that were traumatizing white people. And a new campaign to erase and rewrite history was born. Rewriting history is hardly new. However, we need to see this particular attempt as a Trumpist legacy, where Trumpism is understood as a far-right authoritarian ideological and political construction. Under the Trump administration, we have witnessed the legitimation and proliferation of white supremacist sexism, corporatism, casino capitalism, and militarization, and an aversion to labor and the working class, often reminiscent of fascist ideologies and practices. At the same time, Trump administration's discourse and policies have been openly legitimizing a backlash on immigration with the wall on Mexico, the travel bans, ICE raids, a renewed nationalism and trade protectionism, the notion of America first, the trade war with China. An attack on social welfare with distribution of wealth upward and slashing social programs and dismantling social safety nets. And the most reactionary and violent policies in healthcare, education, and labor that have adversely affected the lives of ordinary people. The meteoric rise of far-right authoritarianism across the world brought the normalization of far-right extremism and its discourses, as well as the legitimation and disseminations of new versions of history. In these versions, Nazis were not all that bad. They actually did some good things, and those who collaborated with Nazis against their country might have been noble people after all. Same with slave owners. And maybe existing historiography has been blowing things out of proportion. And it's better to avoid teaching particular elements of history because they may traumatize students or make them feel uncomfortable or guilty for things they should not be held responsible. Slavery, for example. So what's happening is that the far right is unapologetically rewriting history. This is not news, you'll say. I mean, this has been going on. But today I want to explore more our relation to the past, or rather our society's relation to the past, and our students' and schools' relation to the past, because this relationship is deeply political, pedagogical, and yes, historical. History has always had a polarizing effect in the mainstream imaginary. The reason might be that the values, beliefs, ideologies, and practices, as well as the desires and fears of large groups of people, depend on and are shaped through their relationship to the past, through their gaze upon it. In this relationship, humans are registered as subjects or objects in the stories told. History, in some sense, is our relationship to ourselves, our families, our communities, our societies, and the world. As a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, has noted, there is no historical reality which is not human. There is no history without humankind and no history for human beings. There is only history of humanity. In far-right authoritarian politics, where humanity is selectively attributed as a special status to specific groups of people, we have in place the construction of a history of inhumanity. So the backlash against critical race theory in the United States that I'm discussing tonight is important. It's not important just because, you know, it's racist rhetoric or in terms of discourse. Reactionary conservatives, through legislation, are attempting to radically alter curricular content and regulate the historical knowledge produced in public schools. You're going to say, yeah, they've been doing that for years, right? It's not new. Yes, but this debate is actually important beyond education. Why? First, it has been mobilizing people across the political spectrum, including reactionary forces, ultra-conservatives, white parents, and their wealthy donors, giving the movement an unprecedented dynamic and funding. There is a lot of money going into this debate. It has been backed and funded by ultra-conservative political action committees known as PACs. These are organizations, these are organized for the purpose of raising and spending money to elect or defeat candidates in the United States. And I mean, the lineup is really impressive here. This is the 1776 Project PAC, promoting patriotism and pride in American history. This is, which one is that? I can't even see. Hold on, let me see. That's the Citizens for Renewing America. That's Citizens for Renewing America, sorry, this is my favorite. That's their special site, part of the site on critical race theory. And join our Fight for Schools. Fight for Schools is the name of this specific PAC. And this is the very well-known Heritage Foundation. In their section on critical race theory, they have an article called Zombie Marxism. And this is the No Left Turn in Education. It's a very, very powerful organization. It has chapters in 126 cities across the United States and a lot of power. So these are some of the groups, involved in the debate. And this is the second reason, the players. Who are the players? The third reason is that the right is using the attacks as a tool to mobilize right-wing voters, reclaim school boards. School boards are elected in the United States, and thus win local, state, and national elections, which will allow them to pass policy to further criminalization, voter suppression, etc. I mean, these are real material consequences. Their goal is to continue playing into Trumpism by turning racial anxiety into political energy and power. In the process, they are aiming to overturn many of the policies and victories organizing groups have fought for, like restorative practices, progressive inclusive curricula, black student organizations, etc. Finally, and most importantly, it is turning into a very hot political issue, and one I think is going to be on the ballot in the next presidential election. Why I'm saying that? It was an issue during the midterm and gubernatorial races. For example, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin was elected in part on his anti-CRT theory platform, and the recently re-elected Republican Florida governor, the famous Ron DeSantis, is a staunch anti-CRT player, and he may very well be the next Republican nominee for US president in the 2024 presidential run. Without a doubt, this initial success that conservative lawmakers have had will give the anti-CRT campaign more traction, gaining support by those white segments of the population who were swayed by Trump's racist rhetoric. So for the Republican Party, whose goal is to really solidify and conserve white symbolic and material power, CRT is the perfect enemy. So what is critical race theory? What is this thing? The relationship between race, racism, and power that critical race theory scholars have been uncovering and analyzing seems to pose a threat to the dominant narrative. And by now you should all be wondering what is so threatening about critical race theory. So, critical race theory's predecessors are critical legal studies. I'm talking about the mid-70s in the United States that aimed at exposing the ways American law served and legitimized an oppressive social order. Harvard legal scholar Derek Bell, in the context of the 1954 landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that's the decision that ordered the end of state-mandated school segregation in public schools, 1954, that's recent history. So Derek Bell used the concept of interest convergence, the idea that black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and black interests converge. Early CRT theorists, including Derek Bell that I just mentioned, and Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Mari Matsuda, Patricia Williams, and many others, argued that white supremacy of the past lived on in the laws and societal rules of the present. They focused on the role law played in establishing, maintaining, and perpetuating racial discrimination and segregation, including housing segregation, as well as racist practices, for example, in bank loans, discriminatory labor practices, inequities in education, and so forth. They further stressed that racism is ordinary, not aberrational. It's the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in the United States. In this vein, race and races are products of social thought and relations. They are not objective, inherent, or fixed. They correspond to no biological or genetic reality. Rather, races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. Here, I want to point out that there are currently different versions of CRT across different disciplines, so it has moved beyond legal studies to education, English, sociology, political science, anthropology, etc. Critical race theory has put race at the core of its analysis, presenting the history of white supremacy and revealing the systemic, legal, and other mechanisms that have maintained and continue to maintain racial division and discrimination. For example, going back to the CRT debate in schools, through CRT, students might be able to grasp the context behind the 9 minutes and 29 seconds Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was kneeling on George Floyd's neck, resulting to his death. Or why nobody has been charged yet and convicted for 14-year-old Emmett Till's death in 1955. I remind you, Till was kidnapped, lynched, and tortured and killed in Mississippi. So the question becomes, first of all, is this what public schools are really teaching and thus the backlash? And if so, still, what is so threatening about it, right? So before I answer those questions, I would like to map what's happening currently on the ground in the United States. And as of today, and since the whole backlash started with George Floyd's killing, there have been 193 attempts at the state level to propose legislation that would prevent educators from teaching the role of racism, sexism, and oppression throughout US history to K-12 students across the country. Of those 193, 19 have become state law. For example, I'm not going to list all 19 of them, but just mentioning Arizona because it's interesting, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Tennessee, and of course, Texas. In line with Trumpism's racist legacy, conservative and Republican lawmakers across the United States have been advancing bills that prohibit public schools and public universities from teaching that, quote, any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior. Tenets that, according to those bills, are often found in critical race theory. The bills also prohibit teaching that individuals, by virtue of sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin, are, quote, inherently responsible for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, etc. And here I have some language from the most interesting ones. I mean, there's 193 of them, so it was hard to choose. There was so much, the richness, you know. Yeah, an individual cannot bear responsibility or receive adverse treatment because of actions committed in the past, which to me was a phrase that really stuck. What is actions committed in the past to talk about history? So. Educational Week conducted a really interesting investigation, and they came up with 5 categories of regulation. So first, divisive or racist, sexist concepts. For example, there are bans on teaching all or some of the concepts in Trump's executive order that I will discuss in a minute. Other rules related to discussing identity. So there are proposals that restrict making race, gender, or other social identities salient in some way. The banning of action civics. There is language in those bills that prohibits students from participating in advocacy for course credit, which is something that often happens. And also limits on how teachers can talk about current events. So, you know, if there are, for example, massive demonstrations outside the classroom, the teacher is limited in what they can do if students ask them, right? Curriculum transparency, another very problematic legislation. There are proposals that would require schools to publicly list the materials that teachers use. And finally, prohibitions against teachers showing bias. There's language in those bills that where teachers cannot show political or partisan bias in the classroom, whatever that might mean. Most legislation upholds the principle of the colorblind society, where people are judged based on their individual merits and character, not their skin color or other characteristics. And those of you who may have read Michelle Alexander, she has this incredible book, The New Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander has argued that color blindness has proved to be catastrophic for African Americans, since systematic mass incarceration of people of color in the United States would not have been possible in the post-civil rights era if the nation had not fallen under the spell of a callous color blindness. And Alexander continues, the deeply flawed nature of color blindness as a governing principle is evidenced by the fact that the public consensus supporting mass incarceration is officially colorblind. It purports to see black and brown men, not as black and brown, but simply as men, raceless men, who have failed miserably to play by the rules the rest of us follow quite naturally. The fact that so many black and brown men are rounded up for drug crimes that go largely ignored when committed by whites is unseen. Our collective colorblindness prevents us from seeing this basic fact. Our blindness also prevents us from seeing the racial structural divisions that persist in society. The segregated unequal schools, the segregated jobless ghettos, and the segregated public discourse, a public conversation that excludes the current pariah caste. Our commitment to colorblindness extends beyond individuals to institutions and social arrangements. We have become blind not so much to race, but to the existence of racial caste in America. And what these bills really mean by critical race theory is really any discussion on race or any other intersection for that matter. And the term has become like a catchy phrase, a catch-all for any conversation about historical or present inequalities. There's a massive disinformation campaign around what CRT really is. I mean, try to Google it and you'll understand what I'm talking about. There's a massive misinformation about what schools do. And that works because it creates this necessary ideological confusion that gains supporters from across the aisle. But why CRT, right? Why? The instigator seems to be this journalist, Christopher Rufo. He's now, I don't remember. I think he's at the Heritage Foundation now, maybe. I'll have to check that. So I mentioned him at the very beginning. He's the guy who tweeted about the red washing. So what happened is he got his hands on some diversity slides from the city of Seattle, and in reading those slides, there were some references, and he traced those references back to some scholars, and he concluded that these scholars were explicitly Marxist, and they were referring to the critical theory text from the 1960-68, right? So he made this whole thing up. And I mean, you have to think that conservatives who are engaged in cultural wars needed a new language, a new enemy. And since Trump made political correctness irrelevant, so they couldn't use political correctness, CRT became the perfect villain. Let's put it this way, a promising political weapon. So Rufo said, strung together, the phrase critical race theory connotes hostile, academic, divisive, race-obsessed, poisonous, elitist, anti-American. And the interesting thing is that when Rufo came out with that, he appeared on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News, and then he appealed to President Trump to stop this training. And interestingly, as he says in an interview in The New Yorker, the next day, Mark Meadows, who was Trump's chief of staff, called him to follow up on this idea. So after he appeared on Fox News, Mark Meadows called him, and this is how CRT started. I know, it's shocking. So, as I said, 193 legislative attempts. I went through all of them. And there are definitely some patterns in the language, and these are the main arguments that you can see in those anti-CRT bills. First of all, that CRT is racist and divisive because it teaches people to hate each other. CRT teaches that America is an inherently racist country and white Americans are stained with the original sin of racism for which they can never be cleansed. CRT's solution is to remake the US, abandoning our founding documents and the capitalist system, which is a problem for anti-CRT supporters. Second, discussions around race and slavery create discomfort, guilt, and anguish, and other forms of psychological distress to white students. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, cannot bear responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. I have found language that says that CRT advocates the violent overthrow of the United States government. CRT is authoritarian because it imposes a certain view. That's also interesting. There's discussion on meritocracy. They say meritocracy is the process through which people can succeed. Individuals have the ability to succeed if they are given sufficient opportunity and they are committed to seizing that opportunity through hard work, pursuit of education, and good citizenship. So why do you need, anti-racist education where you have meritocracy and access to opportunity? Slavery and racism are nothing more, and that's really interesting for my discussion, slavery and racism are nothing more than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. So, slavery and racism are not in line with the American values, says language on those bills. And finally, slavery and racism belong to the past. We are looking into the future, progress, prosperity, and unity, and all that fluff. And at the core of most bills, including the 19 signed into law, there is language lifted from the famous September 2020 executive order by former President Trump. So now I'm going to talk about the Trumpist legacy. The ongoing backlash against CRT can be understood as former President Trump's reactionary far-right authoritarian legacy. And it all began when Trump started cracking down on those diversity trainings thanks to Rufo, who appeared on Tucker Carlson, etc. Trump claimed that federal agencies were using critical race theory tenets that not only run counter to the fundamental beliefs for which our nation has stood since its inception, but they also engendered division and resentment within the federal workforce, because these were taking place in the workplace in federal, at that federal level. Clearly, in Trump's and the Republican Party's account, it is the mere acknowledgement of diversity dividing the country, and not the fact that diversity is built on difference, human exploitation, violence, and pervasive systemic racism, as delineated in a wealth of inequity patterns. In Trump's directive, diversity training is called divisive, false, anti-American, un-American, and demeaning propaganda, and as such, it must be eradicated. As diversity refers to multiple and diverse groups of human beings, really, diversity is not just a term, it refers to people, and they seem to be the problem. The underlying assumption is that we should render these people invisible, or worse, eradicate them. Of course, this should hardly come as a surprise coming from the president who built his alliances playing nice with and giving space to white supremacists and other far-right extremists for 4 years. Faithful to the Trumpist manual, the former administration bluntly rejected the violent history of slavery, blaming instead the victims of this violent history for making their co-workers feel resentful and uncomfortable. Trumpism has largely built on race divisions and on a racialized version of patriotism to create the ideological confusion necessary for its sustenance, particularly with white working-class voters. This perverse race-based patriotism has been at the core of the former president's far-right authoritarian politics and discourse. Trump's hate relationship with critical race theory, with people of color really, I would say, was better illustrated in his talk on Constitution Day at the National Archives Museum in the context of the first White House Conference on History. Picture that. Where he announced the creation of a commission to promote patriotic education with the aim of developing a pro-American curriculum that celebrates the truth about our nation's great history. What else? The truth in his pronouncement creates the assumption that there is in place an untruthful anti-American curriculum that is not teaching the United States great history, but different version, what he calls a twisted web of lies, promoted by the left and other radicals. I'm quoting, "Teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense." I think that was in the previous slide. Yes. He said, referring to critical race theory, arguing what he termed, against what he termed toxic propaganda, ideological poison, indoctrination, and cancel culture from the radical movement. He further attacked the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project, which is a historical analysis of how slavery shaped American political, social, and economic institutions. Well, what he offered instead was patriotic education that proposed to focus and celebrate the legacy of 1776 when American colonies declared independence from Great Britain. And during that talk also there he attacked, of course, Howard Zinn, author of People's History of the United States, finding him as a very problematic figure, and teaching his book was the utmost sin. So let me move on now to Ron DeSantis, which I think is another interesting figure in the debate. And as I said, he may be the next presidential candidate. So what he does matters. So along the same lines, back in March 2021, Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis attacked critical race theory, calling it a politicized academic fad that reflects what's really ideology, not actual facts. Asserting that there is no room and no funding, of course, for theories that teach kids to hate their country and hate each other. DeSantis argued that we should not treat each other based on race, but rather as individuals. Our schools, he said, are supposed to give people a foundation of knowledge, not supposed to be indoctrination centers where you're trying to push specific ideologies. DeSantis used the well-known conservative argument for school neutrality and criticized the educational push for anti-racist ideologies, but not the white supremacist, exceptionalist, ethnocentric ideologies that have historically dominated the curriculum, generating in turn even more racism in educational institutions. What you see now with the rise of this woke ideology is an attempt to really delegitimize our history and to delegitimize our institutions. And I view the wokeness as a form of cultural Marxism. DeSantis said that when he started first floating the legislation. What's interesting, however, is that the most substantial and legit critique, theoretical, serious critique, for critical race theory came from Marxist scholars. And yet, DeSantis thinks CRT, is a Marxist attack. They really want to tear at the fabric of our society, he insisted. So for DeSantis, the analysis and understanding of race and racism in the United States and the ways they have maintained and perpetuated systems of oppression and symbolic and material violence against people of color is what's truly divisive. The underlying assumption is that there is, in fact, a unifying version of history, what makes America great, and this version is somehow not ideological. The educational neutrality argument and the divisiveness narrative reveal what's at the root of the issue. It's not that conservatives do not want ideology in the schools. They simply want their ideology. And they want to use neutrality on their terms as they rewrite the past, reducing history to actions committed in the past. However, we know that choices about which histories count are legitimized and taught in schools is not an educational issue, it's a deeply political issue. So what all the post-Trump bills point to is what I think I will call a new American racist historical revisionism, and much in the way that European historical revisionism attempted to absolve fascism of its crimes, the new American historical revisionism is attempting to absolve white privileged America from enslavement, white supremacy and violent racism, and the capitalist system that made this possible, of course. So it seems to me that far-right authoritarianism through historical revisionism penetrates a fragile and unmoored an alienated human psyche, people who need to believe something, to blame someone, to root themselves in a narrative, any narrative. Because the politics of immiseration in capitalism generate this sense of uprooting, the sense of not belonging, not being understood and heard. In this context, then, revisionism creates from fragments what Valencia Garcia calls an alternative timeline by imposing the present on the past. And this fragmented and distorted version, in this fragmented and distorted version, people recognize a piece of themselves, a part of themselves. And I think this is what's happening with critical race theory in this attempt to erase slavery and racism in US history. And so I'm thinking to myself, what are these actions committed in the past that conservatives want to exculpate? Enslavement of people, cotton fields, forced labor, lynching, nooses, and white robes, stealing native lands and annihilating native populations, boarding schools for Indian children, segregated schools until the 50s. What is left to teach if we erase actions committed in the past by members of specific groups, when human history is a history of violence and oppression and exploitation of some groups over others? So how do violent facts of very recent history become issues of discomfort, and who is uneasy about them after all, and why? What is left to learn if we sterilize our teaching from the struggles and fights of humanity, and at the end, who benefits from erasing actions committed in the past from our collective memory? Instead of addressing the pervasive racial segregation of schools almost 70 years after the Brown v. Board of Education that I mentioned earlier, and using the law to not only protect civil rights and securing racial equality, but also to undo these legal structures that still maintain and feed systemic racism, the core of CRT, far-right conservative legislators are simply using it to erase race so that they do not have to address it and perpetuate the existing systemic racist status quo. And yet, black students have been disproportionately at the receiving end of school discipline, or they are more likely to be seen as problematic and more likely to be punished than white students are for the exact same offenses. Black males disproportionately make up prison population, being 6 times more likely to be in prison than whites. Black families disproportionately live in low-income neighborhoods and are disproportionately stricken with poverty. The poverty rate for African Americans is more than double that of whites. African Americans are disproportionately affected by the wealth gap, regardless of households' education, marital status, age, or income. The median wealth for black households with a college degree equaled about 70% of the median wealth for white households without a college degree. Of course, police killings continue unabated at 2.5 times the rate for black men as for white men. 1 in 1,000 black men and boys can be expected to be killed by police at some point in their lifetime, and dying at the hands of law enforcement is the leading cause of death among black men. All these facts in DeSantis and other Republican conservatives and neoconservatives' vision of human societies must be isolated accidents of history, rather than manifestations of systemic racism. But how exactly is it, I wonder, to live one's life always disproportionately to the white norm? So the control over the collective historical narrative is central in far-right politics, and Trumpism has successfully integrated a dangerous historical revisionism into their muddy ideological mix. The dominant economic group justifies its power with stories that construct reality in ways that maintain their privilege and power. However, this is not just Trumpism at work here, it's a colonial legacy, it's racialized capitalism, it is racism rooted in the very fabric of this country, the United States, from settler colonialism to Jim Crow to the prison industrial complex to police brutality against blacks. So the whitewashing and distortion of history has traditionally been at the core of all ideological struggles. There's a version of the past that is better left forgotten or better erased, and wounds can painlessly be healed with a beautiful star-spangled red, white, and blue shiny Band-Aid. So this is a historical remembrance a la carte that does not disturb neither neoconservative happy consciousness nor liberal fantasies of equality and social justice. If something is going to be remembered, it cannot be painful or uncomfortable. I will now turn to the theme of historical revisionism in an attempt to eventually articulate a critical pedagogy project as a deeply historical project. I'm going to talk about emergency time. The rise of authoritarianism, far-right politics, and the emboldened revival and normalization of neo-Nazi and racist ideologies are still perceived as accidents of history. Every time something happens, we are all in awe, like, how could that happen, right? Today, they're seen as stains in the human progress. So I want to bring in here German philosopher and Frankfurt School affiliate Walter Benjamin's discussion on progress and emergency time. Benjamin, in his booklet on the concept of history, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, was written in the early days of 1940. He challenges positivistic notions about history, actions committed in the past. That's a positivistic notion about history. And he also challenges the thesis that the past is a predictable continuum towards progress into the present. And that, as Penny notes, the arc of history bends naturally toward justice. No, that's not happening. He further cautions on the danger of the return of fascism in the human life scene. For him, progress is not a linear path towards the improvement of human societies, but rather the platform for the emergence of human atrocities. Fascism, often perceived as an exception to the norm of progress or as an accident of history for positivistic historiography, is for Benjamin nothing more but a violent expression of the permanent state of emergency. If progress is supposedly where humans unequivocally headed to, how can we explain the global ongoing exploitation of humanity that keeps generating more poverty and greater inequity in distribution of wealth and power? If progress is where we're naturally headed, how can we explain the dark historical landscape of far-right authoritarian populism since the 80s? It's not recent, right, and it's not going away. That also culminated in the 4 years of Trump that I am discussing right now. Or the persistence of racism. When history is seen as a permanent state of emergency, then such movements and phenomena are not exceptions. They are embedded in history's violent fabric. In the revisionist historical narrative of far-right movements, progress and moving forward is the idea of get over our past that we saw previously in the bills. So these are used as ideological devices to either uproot people from their historical grounding or to whitewash and smooth out violent histories, as is the case with racism in America as presented earlier. I will now discuss some features of this revisionist historical narrative in the context of this project and try to frame history as a critical pedagogical project, and pedagogy as a historical project, of course. I need to give credit for those graphics in my slides. They come from Rethinking Schools, which is a progressive educational magazine in the United States, and so these are taken from there. Okay, revisionism, historical revisionism. And here I'm going to bring a little bit of discourse, since I am a linguist, after all. At the end of every day, I am a linguist. How do events acquire meaning? How are historical narratives filled with meaning over and over? As here and others observe, history as a retrospectively composed and meaning-endowed narrative is always construction and fictionalization. Historical phenomena, as the result of social processes, are born out of contradiction, conflict, and the struggle over meaning. In this struggle, some events will become carriers of consensual values and ideals and will therefore have value as objects in collective memory. The process of retrospective attribution of meaning includes conflict, since decisions are being made on inclusions and exclusions and the production of specific discourses. Historical narratives are carried and reproduced through discourses in history books, in films, documentaries, political speeches, and legislative bills, as I showed earlier. Yeah, they do create historical narratives that legitimize specific versions. So history, written or oral, official or unofficial, distant or recent, is always a text of some sorts, right? It's impossible to escape its textual nature. Revisionism. So historical revisionism, I mean, here in Europe we are very familiar with this term, but in the United States it doesn't exist as such in the bibliography. So it is a contested term. It has taken distinct content in different continents and historiographical traditions. For the project at hand, it is important to define it and use it in the Trumpist context. So I like Traverso's work here. In his New Faces of Fascism, he presents this short genealogy of the term that reveals that it is in fact historiographical as much as it is political. It is borrowed from political theory, where it was used to either characterize reformist politics or those deviations from orthodoxy based on wrong interpretation. When transposed to historiography, it maintained a negative connotation, designating the abandonment of canonical interpretations and the adoption of new political controversial views. It should be noted, of course, that historical revisions per se are a good thing. I mean, they're a legitimate process of historical inquiry. They're necessary to unearth and add new pieces to existing historical knowledge. The writing of human history is an ongoing, unfinished project, the same way human life is, of course. But Traverso notes that each society has its own regime of historicity, its own relationship with the past, and revisionism is in turn putting both this relationship with the past and the regime of historicity into question. Because we always write history from the present, our present gaze can change our relationship with our past. As such, the regime of historicity also comprises our relationship with the present, in that history is also taking place now. In essence, revisionism is really about the political and ideological goals of revisions, because many historical revisions, usually accused of revisionism, imply an ethical and political turn in our vision of the past. I mean, you know, in European historiography, revisionism emerged as an attempt to revisit and rehabilitate fascism, to equate it with communism by looking at both as popular revolutions of the two extremes. And this version of historical revisionism further built tolerance to fascism, downplaying its atrocities after World War II, thus shifting people's perceptions and feelings about them. And this is important because far-right populist leaders in Europe capitalized on this shift to promote their political agenda. So I will now turn the discussion into some of the characteristics of historical revisionism as they apply to the anti-CRT debate. Yeah, this is the nice US history department here on my slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about instrumentalism of history and historical knowledge. So I like this quote. Adorno cites Goethe, and the devil says, and it's as good as if it never happened. And, you know, it reveals this innermost principle, the destruction of memory. And we know, well, the devil says that, and we know that the devil is in the details because this phrase summarizes the hegemonic conservative view of history. It speaks to the actions committed in the past, discussed earlier, where these are seen as disconnected from their effects, the agents who have committed them. I mean, the linguist in me cannot help but notice the passivization, actions committed in the past by, as opposed who committed these actions, right? Also the vagueness, the past. Memories destructed and select historical narratives as linear sequences of privileged events are neatly tucked into boxes attached to dates and to heroic figures as they are washed, sterilized, and polished to articulate and complement the official national narrative around one country, one nation, and one culture. At the same time, many other events and actions are as good as if they never happened, the same way that many people and groups of people never existed. And this erasure of huge swaths of humanity is a fundamental feature of the school curriculum and beyond the school curriculum, I mean, in the broader political discourse. As Adorno again powerfully has argued in terms of this destruction of memory, the erasure, he says, the murdered are to be cheated out of the single remaining thing that our powerlessness can offer them, remembrance. I think this is a very powerful way that speaks to this erasure of parts of humanity and what they have done. So these make up this instrumentalist and positivistic character of official history and their construction in just one dimension, because their intention is to close the books of the past and, if possible, even remove it from memory. They appeal to objectivity, to ideological purging, and of course this serves as an excuse for the imposition of other versions. And I think DeSantis' notion of these actions committed to the past speaks exactly to this instrumentalism. This is why DeSantis refers to actions and not history. Actions are part of historical narrative rather than disconnected chunks that just happen randomly. But randomness is what this positivistic and instrumentalist view of history promotes. And as I mentioned earlier, in one of the bills, they mentioned how slavery and racism are deviations from and betrayals or failures. That's also an interesting way, interesting to say the least, interesting way to think about history. So historical revisionism has also produced historical relativism, and historical relativism has been legitimizing this individualistic approach to history that presents subjective understanding or marginal opinions as a historical dimension of an event. Everybody, I mean, if you are on social media, about any historical event, about anything that's happened, everybody has a historical, not an opinion, a historical opinion about it. So this historical relativism has given rise to the phenomenon of producing highly individualized versions of history. And this reactionary conservative solution to avoid going into systemic issues that would have to name oppressors and oppressed, colonizers and colonized, and the system, capitalism that sustains them, or the reasons and the root causes, is to treat people as individuals, right? There are no collectives, there are no alliances, there is no solidarity. And also, as individual students are seen as biological, psychological beings, right? Not as members of specific groups and societies. Polarization, or the myth of two extremes. I mean, we're all too familiar here in Greece with the term. That's why I picked a Greek graphic here. I would have... So the debate over CIT is further positioned as a fight between two opposing sides. What has been lying at the core of Trumpism and other far-right and right-wing populist movements? The political, discursive, and performative dichotomy between two poles, right? Two extremes. A vertical distinction created by intentional, deliberate ideological confusion. We have here what Marcuse has called the typical unification of opposites in discourse. In constructing the left as the enemy, the anti-CRT movement flips the argument made against them that what is wrong with our society is wokeness and left authoritarianism. This is why, to me, it was interesting to see that they say CRT is racist. For example, when I studied the neo-Nazi platform Iron March as part of a different project, what struck me was that neo-Nazis, in one of the discussions in the fora, they said, the left are the true fascists. So it's the exact same argument that I find disturbingly fascinating. Sorry, I have to say that. So yeah, I was talking about the two extremes, and arguments and characterizations historically reserved for far-right extremists and fascists are now reframed, recontextualized, and directed against the left. This device further fits in this distorted idea of the two extremes. The two poles in this ideological construction are, of course, the extreme left and the extreme right, and they are compared on equal terms. If one extreme can be bad, the other can also be bad. An argument straight out of historical revisionism. Number 4, it's a purposeful ideological confusion. I mean, this is, I think it's a device that works really well in the context of Trumpism. In the United States context, white America has been very anxious to revise its own very recent history that has been particularly violent with non-whites, and examples of such revisionist narratives have been presented in the beginning of this talk with all the curricular interventions. And familiar examples also for the two poles is the famous Charlottesville rally, where there were really nice people on both sides, according to President Trump. So these extreme arguments are legitimized and normalized through the creation of this purposeful ideological confusion. Trumpism embodies a political style that meshes various ideologies and brings together lower middle class insecurities while allying with core elements of the ruling class. This is a thin ideology because it does not constitute a coherent structure of beliefs, but assembles contradictory ideologies in an eclectic fashion. So if you think about Trumpism, it brings together people who embrace any of the following: racism, white supremacy, misogynism, sexism, militarism, free markets, conspiracy theories, aversion for the system, Republican values, anti-abortion, faith, different versions of Christianity. All of this is part of this fuzzy ideological mix. And let me also say that this American revisionism has received a great boost through social media, particularly in the form of those widespread conspiracy theories. I'm sure you all know about QAnon. There was a 2020 NPR poll, and fewer than half of the respondents were able to correctly identify that this statement is false. The statement goes like that: a group of Satan-worshipping elites who run a child sex ring are trying to control our politics and media. So fewer than half of respondents were able to correctly identify that this statement is false. Dehistoricization, that also applies a lot in the discourse, but in far-right authoritarian context, dehistoricization is a central process and manifests in the production of discourses and historical narrative that deliberately lack a historical dimension. I mean, think of the infamous also end of history here. So this erasure of historical thinking and the apotheosis of the present, the here and now, are core features of these revisionist discourses because they work as a celebration of the present. And since, you know, since according to anti-CRT legislation, discussions around race and slavery create discomfort, guilt, and anguish, and other forms of psychological distress to white people, I want to talk a little bit about this notion of trauma. As stated, the traumatizing dimension of history aims neither at forcing humans to relive the trauma, nor to play the blame game. It is the ability to look at the horror and struggles straight in the face, to allow oneself to be affected by other people's lives and histories. It aims at connecting humanity with their kin, to relate at the most fundamental level, affect, the perishability and fragility of humans. What the mind and intellect might resist understanding, affect can record in the language of humanity. So it speaks to the ability to imagine, to put together the picture of that which occurred and use it pedagogically. It's not about castigating or, you know, making people feel uncomfortable. I am wrapping up now. So I want to talk about how to make the pedagogical historical and the historical pedagogical, because I am in pedagogy. So I have brought earlier Benjamin's concept of emergency situation. And emergency situation crystallizes the ongoing struggle over historicity, collective memory, meaning, and human practices. Because fascism is always apparently the alternative future struggling to be born, according to Penny, there's another struggle for different alternative futures to be fought. And this struggle is also deeply pedagogical. In the context of emergency time, I want to articulate a proposal for a pedagogical project that puts historicity at its core. Historicity resonates with understanding humans as actors, agents of history, and looking at all knowledge and learning, whether official and unofficial, inside and outside of schools and in multiple sites, is deeply historical. It is historical in that it is a substantial element of an agentive process that has the potential to develop critical consciousness in humans. Historicity also suggests reading the past as present in a process that neither worships the past nor annihilates it in the name of the tyranny of the present. So this is a pedagogical project that challenges one-dimensionality in historical thinking in educational sites and in public discourse and debates, and brings the disturbing elements of time at the core of our analysis. I am proposing a pedagogy that always exists in historical terms as a liberatory project, very much along the lines of what Paulo Freire envisioned in his own work. So the pedagogical historical project is therefore a humanizing project. Along the same lines, a fundamental element in this pedagogy would also be the historicization of social conflicts. Students and educators should have historical and current knowledge about social struggles, the way these have been shaped historically, and what they mean for their lives today. These narratives of collective memory might enable people to read the world and position themselves in it and make choices that would put them on the right side of history. And yes, there is a right side of history. I'm not postmodern. Reflecting on our societies and social practices, we can witness critical thought becoming historical consciousness. It is this consciousness that navigates as a compass through the history of humans and humanity. So critical pedagogy scholarship should forcefully address the anti-CRT debate. It must engage with the core matter of thinking historically and center historical knowledge in our pedagogical and theoretical practices. Often, the very analysis in critical pedagogy literature are themselves superficial and dehistoricized, and very often they serve as a vehicle for progressive politics. So exploring and challenging historical revisionism and the demise of historical thinking by authoritarian far-right racialized capitalism is an important project in the framework of critical pedagogy. It is also important to articulate a critique against forms of progressive politics that are only willing to accept non-threatening versions of history. Finally, it is important to capitalize on the lessons from anti-pedagogy, create our counter-pedagogies with courage, honesty, humility, and commitment by revisiting our relationship with the past. The past will have been worked through only when the causes of what happened then have been eliminated. Only because the causes continue to exist does the captivating spell of the past remain to this day unbroken, says Adorno. It's not me, it's Adorno. So to break the captivating spell of the past, we need to develop an honest, consistent, humble radicalism that, according to Freire, is committed to human liberation and does not become the prisoner of a circle of certainty where reality is also imprisoned. At the end of the day, the core issue to wrestle with is the gradual fascistization of our societies, the celebration of the banality of evil, and the increasing tolerance, if not apotheosis, of authoritarianism worldwide. It's the new concentration camps for refugees, the border violence against immigrants, racial violence, the authoritarian patriarchal violence against women, the day-to-day authoritarian ritual performances for school kids, and many more. The appeal of neo-fascist ideas keeps reaching new heights among many strata of the population. And those who have seen my talks before know that I like to close this with this quote from Walter Benjamin, and it's because it's always a sobering reminder, first to myself. So Benjamin says, to articulate what is past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. The only writer of history with the gift of setting alight the sparks of hope in the past is the one who is convinced of this, that not even the dead will be safe from the enemy if he is victorious. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. Thank you.
Panagiotta, thank you very much. That was super interesting and full of information we lack in Greece as well. So I would like to open it to questions from you. We have a lot of questions, but we always prioritize the public. So the floor is yours. Who would like to start?
Okay, thank you. It's on. Thank you for a fascinating presentation, Panagiotta. I'm just wondering, what is your view about the argument that says that this type of approach essentially feeds into what is called in political science identity politics, and that maybe we should do a progressive politics approach should try to identify ways to engage both blacks and whites, because at the end of the day, the discrimination, of course, is not the same for white working class people as it is for black working class people. But essentially, during the last 40 years, there has been a tremendous rise in inequality. So I'm just worried that this type of approach gives the white working class as a gift to Trumps or whatever. And also, I think that Trump simply solidified what had been going on for the last 30 years. I don't think that Obama had been in terms of actual policies that he implemented, that he made a huge difference. So, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with your last point, and actually, Kianga Yamata Taylor, whom you may know, she has articulated very harsh critique on Obama and what he really did for black people. Nothing, essentially. But to go back to the first part of your question, yes, there are theoretical problems with CRT. I mean, CRT is not without problems, as is any theory, and it has received criticism, as I also said earlier, particularly from Marxist scholars. Positioning, one of their arguments is exactly what you mentioned, like that this theory alienates white working class. And also, by putting race at the core, you are creating all kinds of problems, or you are not identifying the actual structure, which is capitalism, that creates racism. And I agree with that. And there are versions of CRT that now are embracing a Marxist approach. And actually, even the critical legal studies, so where CRT started from, critical legal studies were radical. They were more radical than critical race theory. So critical race theory was like a smooth version of these critical legal studies. So I'm all for the cross-fertilization of these two direction, like the Marxist and the CRT that puts at its core race, because race is huge. I mean, I can't talk enough about what's happening and how important it is in this discussion, in the class discussion, in the Marxist analysis. So yeah, there are people, like I'm thinking of Delgado. Delgado has been bringing more Marxist analysis in his discussion of CRT. So I agree that the two theories have to meet to also to include the class analysis, while at the same time also prioritizing race in the context of this discussion. I was thinking, when I was doing this research, I was thinking of my own kind of objections with CRT, like what you termed identity politics. But then I was thinking, yes, but the far right is attacking it, and the far right is my enemy. So I'm not going to stay here, in theoretical problems of CRT. I'm going to move beyond those. So that was my approach.
Thank you. Any other questions? Maybe while we're waiting, I do have a question. Well, a couple actually, but I'll start with the following. How do other minorities respond to CRT? Because we're talking about critical race theory, and race theory is not just simply, it's mostly about blackness, but how other minorities respond to that, both if there are efforts, theoretically, to appropriate critical race theory for other groups that have been historically discriminated against, and secondly, how do they respond to the politics around it? I mean, we've seen the governor you showed us from DeSantis, was it the name, from Florida, who obviously he comes from Latin America, maybe from Puerto Rico, I'm not sure. And he aligns with the typical kind of like the typical Republican point of view, maybe the Protestant point of view. So how is the situation with regards to other minorities?
Okay, I'll get to DeSantis last, but yes, actually, this is a great question that you're asking about other minorities. So out of critical race theory, there are different branches that are focused to specific groups. So we have LATCRIT, that addresses, Latinos, so critical theory for Latinos. Then there's Asian Crit, again, along the same lines, and these are the ones that come to mind right now. So yes, there is CRT is branching out to the different groups that appropriate the theory, but with a stronger focus on their own ethnic racial groups. So, and there's really interesting research going on there. The second, I think you almost fell into an identity politics argument because you assume that if DeSantis is from Latin America, how can he support that? But this is the problem, that identity is not a guarantee for anything. For sure. Right? I mean, Condoleezza Rice was also black, and Colin Powell, right? So, but your question was not, you asked me about DeSantis?
I asked how other minorities respond to the attack against critical race theory.
Oh, well, you know, we cannot generalize about how. So let me actually.
As organized, perhaps as organized groups, not as individuals, but as organized groups, either in politics or in the university or.
So I guess it might have come across from my presentation that it's, I don't know, there's only black parents behind like the support of CRT, but this is not the case. In the pro-CRT group, there are parents from all, groups, ethnic groups and racial groups in the United States that support having anti-racist curricula and acknowledging these different, intersections in the classroom. So it seems to me that people of color in the United States are behind the CRT. It seems to me that the problem comes mostly from white, I want to add middle-class parents, because in looking at the organizations, the one especially I mentioned that is very, very active, this started from a parent, a father who was a middle-class father, let me add that, who was uncomfortable with what his kid was doing to school, and so, he started organizing, and parents in the United States, they participate in school boards. So to a large degree, school boards where parents and other community members get elected, they have a say, they have power in the curriculum. They can put pressure on state legislation that in turn shapes how curricula develop, so they have a lot of power. And one of the things that white parents are doing, so see, I end up talking about white parents here, so that answers your question about the other groups. So one of the things that white parents are doing through, with the guidance of those groups that I presented earlier, is that they are trying to gain seats in the school boards. So they participate in the elections. If you go on one of the websites, which is the more elaborate, it has step-by-step activism from the right. Go into the parent meetings, agitate, be loud, make noise, fight. I mean, these are like kind of ABCD steps. So these parents are showing up in these board meetings, and there has been a shift in seats in the school board membership across the United States, because once these parents who are associated with these foundations gain those seats, then they have power over the curriculum. So yeah, I think that answered your question, right?
Can we have the microphone, please?
Can't speak without a microphone.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. And sometimes we follow many things, we know a lot of things, but still someone to put them in an order, to, put a context around it is really interesting. Thank you. What I was thinking as you were talking is about these reversing notions, and I find this really, really interesting, and it's very relevant to this far-right discourse. For example, what you were saying that, for example, teaching CRT will traumatize students. Like, you know, how many people are traumatized by racism is the question, not if teaching it will, you know, traumatize students, or that CRT is divisive. It's not racism that is divisive. It's CRT that is divisive. So how is this reversing all the time? Or what you said about teaching CRT, that it's ideological, while not teaching it is neutral, obviously. It's not ideological not to teach it. So I'm really interested how these discourses are reversing all these notions of, you know, around justice, racial justice, or injustice, actually. And following a little bit on this comment, I would like to make a comment about identity politics, not as but more, can we also see it, also identity politics as a reversing? So talking about identities like, you know, race or gender, I don't mean, not talking about them. So what is this? So what I will frame it better, okay. I want to say somehow that it's also identity politics, but from the white part of identity, not to recognize racial discrimination, racism, sexism, and everything. So it's also a reversing, calling it identity when it comes to talking from CRT perspective, for example, but not identity politics when you eliminate the importance of race and gender.
Yeah, that's a great comment. On the traumatizing part, I agree, and often when I discuss it with my students in class, my graduate students, and we go through these bills and we analyze the language, and they are shocked, you know, when they read traumatized, and we are thinking of all the violent history. I'm thinking, well, imagine how traumatized enslaved people were in the ships that came from America to the United States to, you know, in cotton fields. So, I mean, traumatizing now, it's again what I said, this individualistic capitalist construction of who the individual is. So now on the second part of your question, I just want to say that, you know, CRT is not going to solve the problem of racism. So the assumption here is not that by infusing our schools with CRT or anything, you know, similar to that, is going to suddenly eradicate systemic racism. I mean, this is really a liberal fantasy. Now, is it good that we have these kinds of discussions in school? Is it good that the students learn what has happened to this country and how this country was built? I think it's amazing. Also, I don't want us to assume that the history, the way it has been taught until today, you know, is not a dominant version of history, right? So even with CRT, and even, I don't know, who knows, maybe down the road we're going to have an anti-capitalist curriculum. But even so, I mean, schools can do so much. Schools cannot change society, and schools cannot change capitalism or racism, but schools can work on consciousness, student consciousness, and this is very important. That's why, on one hand, yeah, I mean, CRT is not going to eradicate racism, but at the same time, how many students in all states across the US are able to have honest discussions about the past and understand themselves as historical beings? They are not. They live in the here and now. I mean, there's so much research from a progressive point of view of history books and history curricula, the whitewashing. So, yeah, these discussions are necessary, and these, the historicity that I discussed is necessary, but I don't want us to, I don't want us to think that I believe that schools can change that in such a way that, you know, schools are going to change society. Unfortunately, and I am an educator and I am a critical educator, schools are not going to do that.
Hello, thank you for the great presentation. As a scholar based in the US, but with an obvious Greek background, and having just said that schools are not going to resolve the problem, the racism and whatever, I wanted to ask you a bit of how would you see the CRT theory related to Greece or the Greek school or curriculum, because it was recently put to my attention that a group of parents who have adopted from Africa, orphans from Africa, realized that in a third grade religion class book, there was a poem by Kithoros Vetrakos about friendship, and it said this poem used the words negraki, little negro, arapaki, and little gypsy. And they found these words inappropriate and asked the ministry to remove this and another poem with the same words from the curriculum, and the ministry responded that this was irrelevant. So really, Greece obviously doesn't have a huge background of slavery, let's say, or African race, but now we have a huge influx of immigrants because of the climate crisis, climate refugees, and so on from Africa, obviously. We see more black faces in our streets. And recently, of course, talking about racism, recently we heard about a crime that is probably related to racism, a shooting, a police violence incident. So how do you see, and also having to note that we have a big influence by American TV and movies, and that Greeks are very familiar with the notions of racism and police violence. For instance, in Chicago, I've seen many incidents of police violence, so I'm aware, being Greek. So my question is this: how do you see this relevant to Greek school and Greek society? How could Greece or the Southern Balkans or Southern Europe or Europe could benefit from this US trend?
Okay, yeah, that's that was a long question, but I think I know what you're asking me. I mean, I will say that it doesn't have to be critical race theory. If you are designing and implementing progressive curricula, in this progressive curricula, in this critical pedagogic curricula, what you just mentioned is addressed. I mean, I wasn't aware of this specific instance, but I'm not sure, I know actually, that Greek textbooks abound with racism, sexism, ageism, I mean, you name it, consumerism, you name it. I mean, there is actually research, there are analyses in Greece, I believe, on textbooks that colleagues have conducted. So the answer to this instance is not to bring critical race theory in Greece, because remember, for a pedagogy to work and to be effective, it has to be situated. And it is situated when it's created by the people, for the people in this specific instance. So taking into consideration the socio-historical context and the needs of these specific groups of people. For example, I'm thinking, I don't know, the north and the south of Greece have somewhat different needs in terms of, you know, what you could be adding in the curriculum. So, but yeah, I will agree with you that discussions of race have not taken center stage traditionally in our Greek textbooks. So yeah, centering that, especially with what is happening worldwide. And I would say that Greece has been diverse actually for a much longer time than you mentioned, very diverse. Yeah, just because you don't see them, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. But yeah, and also with the influx of refugees and immigrants, you know, this is a pertinent discussion to have. And this is what we should actually, this is what we should be integrating in our curricula. refugees, immigrants, what's happening right now in Greece. This is how our pedagogy is going to be situated.
Have we got any more questions, Yorgo?
Yes, I have several. So I will first simple one. Which was the role of the different churches in the United States in this type of discourses? I mean, evangelical. How they affected and influenced the public discourse towards this type of revisionism, if there was any, influence.
Okay, yeah, this is a good question and one that I don't have in-depth knowledge, but from what I have gathered so far, the parents who are involved are the typical, white Christian religious. I mean, not all of them, so I cannot generalize, but my guess, and this is something that I will definitely explore, is that the church is largely backing anti-CRT.
My second question is that before CRT, one of the national dangers in the context of the United States was cultural Marxism. This was, from 1960s onwards, this was, a catchword of the conservative right. So, and this has been substituted, as it is clear from your talk, from CRT. Do you think that one of the reasons that could explain the shift in the moral panic discourse of the conservative right has to do with the fact of Black Lives Matter? I mean, and to which extent, realities like this, has shifted this discourse towards CRT? Because, neither, cultural Marxism was dominant in the United States. Of course, it was at some moment in the 60s and 70s, but not a dominant thing. There were few followers of Frankfurt School, nor, CRT. And so, and the second part of my question is that to which extent this was, this, is related to realities, or it's just pure discursive, motives.
Yeah, let me also add that after cultural Marxism and before critical race theory, there was also the backlash against ethnic studies in Arizona. So that was also a big saga. But yeah, it seems to me that to start with your last question, how is it connected to reality? It's not connected to reality because it's a construction, right? It's a narrative, but it's a narrative that is built on specific discourses that I presented, but that nevertheless has material consequences. So maybe that was not as much the case with cultural Marxism, but right now, CRT also capitalizes on the aversion to wokeness, which I'm not going to say that I don't understand. This notion that everybody is woke and you can't say anything and you have to, censor yourself. This has gone to some extremes, but this again does not bear on reality. Yeah, Black Lives Matter was a decisive moment that had a dynamic. I know some scholars don't believe that. They don't believe that it was an organized movement and that it had potential, but it seemed to me that the mainstream was threatened by BLM, and a way to manage it without coming across as racist, because how else can you do that, right? So a way to manage it, in a liberal way to manage it, was to attack not BLM, but all these peripheral things. Like I said, I think diversity trainings and, you know, an anti-racist curricula, I mean, are good things, but, you know, come on, it's no big deal. You know, if you go into a diversity training and you hear a few things about slavery, right? It's a good thing, how threatening this is. So it seems to me that this thing kind of blew out of proportions because of the material gains that it could have. So yeah, it was more of a fictional, like, I mean, just explaining to you, because I was also shocked, just explaining to you how it all started. I was just dumbfounded that somebody tweeted something and then he showed up on Fox News and then Trump decided to enact policy.
Last question. There's a debate now, not just in the United States, but around the world. I mean, to which extent Trump was a fascist or not. There are, you know, several debates on this, and my question is the following one. Scholars like Dylan Riley, who was our first speaker, said, you know, to the extent that it does not have, you know, didn't have the features of the typical interwar right, we cannot, you know, register him as a fascist. But from your talk, what becomes clear is that with Trump, many parents felt, you know, that could activated and transformed actively the curriculum. So in reality, in this sense, it is a kind of fascistization through specific actions of people. So the people are mobilized, not really, you know, in the typical sense, but nevertheless, the society, you know, is fascistized. So, I mean, could we argue that, you know, in this sense, Trump left a kind of fascist heritage, and that has, you know, is a stake, a political stake?
Yeah. That's a great question, and one I have been puzzled by when I started studying Trumpism. I know there are different approaches, not just two, but more than two. So I know Dylan Riley doesn't want to talk about Trump as a fascist. I know that on that camp, people claim that there are only two fascisms, the Italian right and the German, the classical fascism, and then that all these far-right political constructions that we see after the 80s do not have the same characteristics. Of course, you have on the other side, you have Paxton, who openly talks about Trumpism as a fascist regime. And then, well, I kind of like Enzo Traverso's approach. So Enzo Traverso talks about fascism as being a transhistorical concept, that you can see it functioning in different periods in different ways. And I mean, I don't know, are you asking me, has Trump read Mein Kampf, or has he watched, you know, Leni Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will? I don't think so, no. But has he demonstrated, first of all, his aversion to working class, and what he did against working class aligns, you know, with fascism and the working class. And also other characteristics that are more around his persona, and that I think, you know, the Frankfurt School, the authoritarian personality, they talk a lot about it. So I think with Trump, large segments of the population were on the far right, the alt-right, neo-Nazis were emboldened. And this emboldenment also has effects. I mean, the Charlottesville rally, you know, was not a discussion about fascism. I mean, people were killed in the Charlottesville rally. So you have material violence, you know, and when you have this kind of material violence, it seems to me that we should not, I don't know, agonize so much about whether Trump is a real fascist or a fake fascist, but I think the analogy with fascism is very useful pedagogically because it keeps us on alert, like going back to the emergency, the Benjamin's emergency time. Like, we can't see Trump as an accident of history, and we can't see alt-right as an accident of history. And, or, you know, what I saw on Iron March, the neo-Nazi platform. It was interesting. Let me tell you how neo-Nazis thought about Trump. So on this platform and the discussions I have seen, many people were thrilled with Trump because they felt they would finally be free to be themselves and to, you know, to share with the world what they're thinking without being afraid. I mean, there was also a group of people who hated Trump because he was not fascist enough, which is interesting. But yes, so the short answer, I guess, is, unfortunately, yes, I think Trump has left a fascist legacy, and he will be remembered as such, and good for that.
Yes, please. Can we have the microphone over there? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering to understand how, you know, building of ideological discourse works in the States. CRT is an academic discourse. How does this, why and how, and whether it does really, how does this, you know, to what extent did it influence school curricula? Because on the one hand, we compare an academic discourse. On the other hand, we refer to the school curricula legislation in order to influence school curricula. But how it did, and whether it did, and at what depth of time did it actually CRT influence school curricula? Why is that important? Because, I mean, if CRT is, in a sense, dominant or important in academic circles, then the whole legislative attempts are a kind of rearguard action. Otherwise, I mean, they should, in terms of building an ideological discourse, they should be targeting academic discourse as such. If they are just targeting school curricula, then they're just, you know, behind what is really happening. Mm-hmm. So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and especially the discourse part, because yes, you are correct, CRT is an academic discourse, but through the process of recontextualization, that's Basil Bernstein, right? How you take academic or scientific knowledge and then it takes a different form in schools or in other spaces. So this academic discourse has been recontextualized in schools as curricular discourse. After George Floyd's murder, it's true that teachers had to deal with student questions. So it was something that came from the ground, like the discussion started from students trying to understand what was happening. And at that point, people who were already working, not just with critical race theory, with anti-racist education, because it seems to me like to just talk about critical race theory is reductionistic in terms of what was really happening in the schools. But so those people in the unions, for example, across teacher unions who in many places are very progressive, they are part of progressive platforms like the one that I discussed, Rethinking Schools, they were trying to find ways to integrate the race discussion in the classroom. Actually, unions in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire, which is one of the states that is like staunchly anti-CRT, the parents are going crazy there. Unions had meetings and they had created presentations. They would go into the board meetings with the parents and try to educate parents because it was important. So it's not just CRT discourse, it's the discussion on race that Republicans and those conservative lawmakers made a caricature of. they made a caricature of, and also they overstated what CRT was actually the grade to which, the degree to which CRT was influencing the curriculum. So yeah, to answer your question, CRT was not like this massive movement across United States public schools where everything was changing and, you know, it was integrated in every subject matter, because it doesn't have to just be in history, right? But, you know, they blew it out of proportion again. Why? Because they needed a new villain, a new enemy to build this new cultural war, this new Red Scare to gain the school boards, to affect legislation, and then this is actually in the United States, because you have all these layers of election and these layers of policies, what is happening in the school board is very important. You think, oh, you know, oh, they have, I don't know, they have a Democrat governor, great. No, you have to always monitor what is happening on the ground. This is what defines how states, this is one of the things, sorry, that defines how states flip, for example, from Democrat to Republic and Republic to Democrat, which are more or less the same, but anyway.
Have we got any more questions? I have a last question, Panayota. I was wondering what any public intellectuals or public personas of the far right, or like close to the far right, have they positioned themselves? I'm thinking like, you know, personalities like Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, who have been very vocal with regards to other issues. For example, around gender. Have they been vocal around CRT?
Yes, they're actually, if you watch Fox News, which I don't, there's a parade of the conservative intelligentsia, if we can call it such, that in different segments where they oppose anti-CRT with supposedly, you know, academic arguments, but also very often they have CRT scholars on air, try to, you know, help them, or they have like, you know, the pro-con scholars, and this is not going very well. But yes, I would say that conservative academics are supporting the cause.
Okay.
I have something else to ask. To which extent this type of moral panic discourse that have been expressed on CRT has been used as a justification for the privatization of the higher education? To which extent? I mean, if there is, you know, that to the extent that universities diffuse, you know, this type of Marxist CRT stuff, that it is an academic discourse, as it was argued, to which extent it has been used as a way, as an argument on behalf of the authorities, conservative authorities, for the non-funding of public institutions, not just universities, but also schools, I mean.
Oh, yeah, I mean, DeSantis, for example, when he first launched the anti-CRT campaign in Florida, he said that he would only dedicate funding to teaching the glorious history of America. So in those states where you have anti-CRT bills, you should be very sure that funding goes towards that direction and nowhere else. And funding can be cut if you don't comply. Yeah.
Okay, then. Panayota, thank you very much for enlightening us. Thank you very much for being with us today. Let me say just one more thing. This is, as we said, this is our last seminar for 2022. We'll be waiting for you on January the 13th. We'll have with us Aristotle Kallis, who's going to talk to us about the banality of fascism. So we'll be waiting for you. Please join us again. Thank you very much for joining us every second Friday. And we look forward, have a happy holiday, and we look forward to see you in January.